The morning of August 7th, 1945, broke over the waters off the coast of Tinian Island with an eerie stillness that veteran fisherman Takeshi Yamamoto would never forget. The sky held that peculiar grey quality that comes just before dawn in the Pacific, when the ocean seems to merge with the heavens in an endless expanse of uncertain light. Takeshi stood at the helm of his modest fishing vessel, the Kayo Maru, a 30-foot wooden boat that had survived the war years through a combination of luck, careful maintenance, and his family's intimate knowledge of these waters. The war had ended just 2 days before, though news traveled slowly to fishing communities, and the reality of peace had not yet fully settled into the consciousness of men who had spent years navigating waters filled with mines, submarines, and the ever-present threat of aerial bombardment. Before we continue with this incredible story, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring you more fascinating historical accounts like this one. Takeshi was 53 years old, with the weathered skin and permanent squint of a man who had spent 4 decades staring into the sun-drenched Pacific. He had taken to the sea at age 13, learning the craft from his father and grandfather before him, memorizing the currents, the seasonal patterns of fish migration, the subtle changes in watercolor that indicated depth and temperature. His hands, rough and scarred from decades of handling nets and lines, moved with practiced efficiency as he prepared his gear for the day's work. The war had been devastating for fishing communities throughout Japan. Many boats had been requisitioned by the military, fishermen conscripted into service, and fishing grounds rendered dangerous by naval operations. But Takeshi had managed to keep the Kayo Maru operating, though at greatly reduced capacity, by staying close to shore and avoiding the larger shipping lanes where military vessels prowled. His crew that morning consisted of his nephew, 22-year-old Hiroshi Nakamura, who had returned from military service with a shattered left arm that had healed poorly, leaving him with limited mobility but still capable of working the nets, and old Kenji Sato, a 67-year-old veteran fisherman whose 3 sons had all died in the war, 2 at sea and 1 in the Philippines. Kenji rarely spoke anymore, but his knowledge of these waters was unmatched, and his presence on the boat was both practical and a quiet act of mercy on Takeshi's part. The old man needed purpose, needed to be at sea, needed the rhythms of the work to keep the grief at bay. They had set out before dawn, as was their custom, heading northwest from their home port of Shimoda toward fishing grounds that Takeshi's family had worked for generations. The waters here, where the warm Kuroshio current met cooler northern waters, created conditions that attracted tuna, mackerel, and bonito. The catch had been poor for years due to the war, but with hostilities ended, Takeshi hoped that the fish populations might begin to recover, that life might slowly return to something resembling normalcy. The morning air was cool, and a light mist hung over the water, reducing visibility to perhaps a quarter mile. Hiroshi stood near the bow, scanning the horizon with binoculars that had once belonged to his father, killed in the bombing of Hiroshima just 1 week earlier, though Hiroshi did not yet know this. News traveled slowly, and the full horror of what had happened to that city was still emerging. Around 8 in the morning, they reached their intended fishing grounds and began to deploy their nets. The work was methodical, requiring coordination between all 3 men, despite the limitations imposed by Hiroshi's injured arm and Kenji's advanced age. They worked in comfortable silence, the only sounds the creak of the boat's timbers, the splash of nets hitting water, and the occasional cry of seabirds that had begun to circle overhead, sensing the possibility of an easy meal. The morning progressed slowly, and the catch was modest but acceptable. Several good-sized bonito, a handful of mackerel, nothing extraordinary, but enough to justify the fuel expenditure and provide food for their families and a small surplus to sell. It was shortly after 10 o'clock when Hiroshi noticed something unusual in the water about 200 yards to starboard. At first, he thought it might be a large piece of debris, perhaps wreckage from one of the many ships that had gone down in these waters during the war years. The Pacific had become a graveyard, littered with the remains of vessels from all the combatant nations. But as he studied it through his binoculars, something about the object's shape and the way it sat in the water struck him as odd. It was cylindrical, dark grey or black, and appeared to be floating just beneath the surface, with only a small portion visible above the waterline. "Uncle," he called out, pointing toward the object. "There is something over there. Strange debris, I think. But I have never seen anything quite like it." Takeshi left the helm and came to stand beside his nephew, accepting the binoculars and raising them to his eyes. He studied the object for several long moments, his expression gradually shifting from casual interest to something more troubled. His years at sea had given him an instinctive sense for when something was out of place, when the normal order of things had been disrupted. This object, whatever it was, triggered that instinct. It was too regular in shape to be natural, too intact to be ordinary debris, and there was something about the way it sat in the water, as if it possessed considerable weight but was somehow designed to float at a specific depth. "Kenji, come look at this," Takeshi said, his voice carrying a note of concern that made both younger men pay attention. The old fisherman shuffled over, moving slowly but steadily, and took his turn with the binoculars. He stared for a long time, saying nothing, his weathered face revealing no emotion. Finally, he lowered the binoculars and turned to Takeshi with an expression that mixed curiosity with wariness. "It looks military," Kenji said quietly. "American, maybe. The shape reminds me of the ordnance I saw when I worked in the shipyards before the war. But this is much larger than any bomb or torpedo I ever encountered." "Should we approach it?" Hiroshi asked, his young face showing more excitement than caution. "Perhaps there is something valuable we can salvage. Metal has been worth so much during the war." Takeshi considered the question carefully. His first instinct was to steer well clear of the object. Unexploded ordnance was common in these waters, and he had heard terrible stories of fishermen killed or maimed when they tried to salvage what they thought was harmless debris. But there was also his nephew's point about value. Metal was indeed precious, and if this was some piece of military equipment that could be safely salvaged, it might provide income his family desperately needed. The war years had been lean, and peace would not immediately restore prosperity. "We will approach slowly," Takeshi decided, "but we maintain a safe distance until we can determine what it is." Kenji is right that it appears to be military in nature, and such things can be dangerous even after the war has ended. He returned to the helm and began to maneuver the Kaiomaru toward the mysterious object, keeping the engine at low speed and maintaining a cautious approach angle. As they drew nearer, the object's size became more apparent. It was far larger than he had initially estimated, perhaps 15 feet in length and several feet in diameter, cylindrical in shape with a blunt nose and what appeared to be stabilizing fins near the tail section. The surface was smooth, painted or coated in a dark material that seemed designed to be difficult to see in water. There were no obvious markings visible, though portions of the object were still submerged. At a distance of about 50 yards, Takeshi cut the engine and allowed the boat to drift. All three men now stood along the starboard rail, staring at the object in silence. The morning sun had burned away most of the mist, and visibility had improved considerably. Seabirds continued to circle overhead, their cries the only sound beyond the gentle lapping of waves against the hull. "It is definitely American," Kenji said, breaking the silence. "Look at the design of those fins. That is not Japanese construction. And see how the metal has that particular finish. I worked on captured American equipment during my time in the shipyards. This is their manufacturing." What kind of weapon could be so large? Hiroshi wondered aloud. I have never seen a torpedo or bomb of such size, even in my military service. Takeshi said nothing, but his unease was growing. Something about this object felt profoundly wrong, though he could not articulate exactly why. It was not just the size, though that was certainly unusual. It was something more fundamental, a sense that they had stumbled upon something that was not meant to be found, something that carried significance beyond their understanding. We should report this to the authorities, Takeshi said finally. This is beyond our capacity to handle. Whatever this is, it is a matter for the military or the new occupation forces. But uncle, Hiroshi protested, what if they simply confiscate it and we receive nothing for our discovery? We could at least attempt to secure it, to tow it to shore where we might have some claim to salvage rights. The boy makes a point, Kenji said quietly. In these uncertain times, with the occupation beginning and everything in chaos, who knows what rights we might have or not have? But there is also wisdom in Takeshi's caution. This object, whatever it is, may be dangerous. And involving ourselves with American military equipment so soon after the war's end could bring complications we are ill-equipped to handle. Takeshi stood silent, weighing the options. His fishing boat carried rope strong enough to secure the object, and they could potentially rig a towing arrangement, but the risks were considerable. If the object was some form of unexploded ordnance, attempting to move it could be catastrophic. On the other hand, simply leaving it here and reporting it might result in their losing any opportunity for compensation, and his family's financial situation was desperate enough that he could not easily dismiss Hiroshi's argument. As he deliberated, a change in the water around the object caught his attention. The cylinder was slowly sinking, its buoyancy apparently beginning to fail. Whatever had kept it floating near the surface was gradually losing effectiveness, and within perhaps an hour or two it would slip beneath the waves entirely and descend to the ocean floor, potentially to be lost forever. We are running out of time to make a decision, Takeshi observed. It is sinking. If we are going to secure it, we must do so now. The three men exchanged glances, and in that moment of shared recognition, the decision was made without words. They would attempt to secure the object, to at least prevent its immediate loss to the depths, and then determine their next course of action. Takeshi began issuing instructions, his voice calm and methodical despite the unusual circumstances. Hiroshi would prepare their strongest rope and the grappling hooks they used for retrieving lost nets. Kenji would rig a towing harness from their spare lines. Takeshi himself would maneuver the boat into position for the attempt. The work proceeded with the practiced efficiency of men who had spent their lives at sea. Hiroshi, despite his damaged arm, proved capable of preparing the lines, securing the grappling hooks with knots that would hold under strain. Kenji's old hands, still nimble when it came to rope work, created a harness arrangement that would distribute the weight of the tow across multiple attachment points on the boat's structure. Takeshi brought the Kaiomaru alongside the sinking object, maintaining a distance of about 20 feet, close enough for their purposes, but not so close that they risked collision if the object shifted unexpectedly. "Throw the first hook," Takeshi commanded, and Hiroshi complied, sending the grappling iron arcing through the air to splash into the water just beyond the cylinder. He pulled back slowly, feeling for purchase, and on the third attempt, the hook caught on one of the object's fins. The line went taut, and they could feel the weight of the thing, substantial but not impossibly heavy. Carefully, Hiroshi secured his line to the boat's strongest cleat, while Kenji prepared to throw a second hook to provide additional security. The old man's throw was less powerful than Hiroshi's, a function of age and declining strength, but his aim was better, refined by decades of experience. His hook caught on the first attempt, snagging on some projection near the object's nose. He too secured his line, and now the mysterious cylinder was tethered to the Kayo Maru by two independent ropes, each capable of bearing significant weight. "Can we lift it?" Hiroshi asked, knowing that bringing the object aboard would provide the best opportunity to examine it and determine its nature and value. Takeshi considered the question, but shook his head. "Too heavy and too risky. We do not know what is inside that thing. If it contains explosives or some other hazardous material, bringing it aboard could endanger the boat and all of us. We will tow it, keeping it in the water, and make for the nearest port where we can report our find to the authorities." "Which port?" Kenji asked. "Shimoda is our home, but the Americans may have already established a presence there. Going to the occupation forces directly might ensure we receive proper credit for the discovery. But it also means we will have less control over what happens next." "We go to Shimoda," Takeshi decided. "It is closest, and I know the harbour master there. He is a reasonable man who served in the Navy before the war. He will know how to handle this properly, and he will ensure we receive fair treatment." With the decision made, Takeshi returned to the helm and slowly engaged the engine, keeping the throttle low. The ropes went taut as the Kayo Maru began to move, and for a moment the object resisted, its weight and water resistance creating significant drag. But the fishing boat was sturdy, built for hauling heavy nets through rough seas, and gradually they began to make headway, towing their mysterious find behind them at a speed of perhaps 3 knots. The journey back to Shimoda would take approximately 5 hours at this pace, and the 3 men settled into a rhythm of watchful waiting. Hiroshi remained near the stern, monitoring the tow lines and the object itself, alert for any signs of trouble. Kenji busied himself with routine boat maintenance, though his eyes frequently returned to their unusual cargo. Takeshi concentrated on navigation, plotting a course that would keep them in relatively shallow water in case the object's buoyancy failed completely and it threatened to drag the boat down. As noon approached, the sun climbed higher in a cloudless sky, and the temperature rose to a point where the men shed their outer layers. The morning's cool mist seemed like a distant memory now, replaced by the familiar heat of a Pacific summer day. Hiroshi broke out their lunch, rice balls that his mother had prepared before dawn, along with dried fish and pickled vegetables. They ate in shifts, 2 men always keeping watch while the third took a brief respite. It was during Takeshi's lunch break, with Kenji at the helm and Hiroshi watching the tow lines, that disaster nearly struck. The object, which had been trailing obediently behind the boat for the past 2 hours, suddenly began to sink more rapidly. Hiroshi shouted a warning, and both older men rushed to the stern to see the cylinder tilting nose down, threatening to upend completely and plunge toward the bottom. The tow lines, still securely attached, were being pulled downward at an alarming angle, and the Kayo Maru's stern began to dip as the weight increased. "Cut the lines," Kenji shouted. "It will take us down with it," but Takeshi hesitated, unwilling to simply lose their find after coming so far. Instead, he ran to the helm and increased engine power, hoping that forward momentum might prevent the object from achieving the vertical angle that would send it plummeting. For several terrifying seconds, the outcome hung in the balance. The boat's engine roared at full throttle, the propeller churning the water to foam, while the mysterious cylinder continued its inexorable tilt toward the vertical. Then, almost miraculously, the sinking arrested. Whether because some air pocket inside the object shifted, or because the increased speed created enough hydrodynamic lift, the cylinder returned to a more horizontal attitude, still floating just beneath the surface. Takeshi reduced engine power back to a more sustainable level, and all 3 men breathed sighs of relief. "That was too close," Hiroshi said, his voice shaking slightly with the after-effects of adrenaline. "We should reconsider whether this salvage is worth the risk." "We are more than halfway to Shimoda now," Takeshi replied, Abandoning the object at this point gains us nothing. We press on, but we remain alert for any further problems. The incident had shaken all three men, reinforcing the sense that they were dealing with something beyond their full comprehension. The object's behavior, the way it seemed to hover at the edge of sinking but never quite went down, suggested sophisticated engineering, a careful balance of buoyancy and weight that spoke to advanced military design. This was not simple ordnance, not a conventional bomb or torpedo that had somehow escaped detonation. This was something else, something purpose-built to specifications that none of them could fully understand. As the afternoon wore on, the coast of the Izu Peninsula gradually became visible on the horizon, a reassuring sight that promised the journey's end was approaching. Fishing boats began to appear with greater frequency, other vessels from Shimoda and neighboring ports going about their daily business. Some of the fishermen shouted greetings to Takeshi, recognizing the Kayo Maru, though none came close enough to see what they were towing. If anyone noticed anything unusual about their slow speed or the strange wake they were creating, they gave no sign. Around 4 in the afternoon, they entered Shimoda Harbor, a natural anchorage that had served as a fishing port for centuries and had, in more recent history, become one of the first Japanese ports open to American ships in the mid-1800s. The harbor was busy with afternoon activity, boats returning from the day's fishing, merchants preparing for the evening fish auction, and a significant American military presence that had arrived in the days since the war's end. Several U.S. Navy vessels were anchored in the deeper water, and American personnel could be seen moving about the docks and waterfront buildings. Takeshi guided the Kayo Maru toward their usual berth, a spot along the older section of the wharf where the commercial fishing fleet typically docked. As they approached, he could see that word of their unusual cargo had somehow preceded them. Perhaps one of the fishermen they had passed had radioed ahead, or perhaps the harbourmaster's watchers had noted their strange tow through binoculars. Whatever the reason, a small crowd had gathered on the dock, and among them stood several American military personnel, their uniforms and equipment marking them as members of the occupation forces. "Bring us alongside slowly," Takeshi instructed Kenji, who had taken the helm for this final approach. "I will go forward and speak with whoever is waiting for us. Hiroshi, be ready to secure the dock lines, but say nothing unless you are directly addressed. We must be careful in how we handle this." The boat eased up to the dock, and Takeshi leapt across the narrow gap to secure the bowline himself. As he straightened up, he found himself facing a young American naval officer, a lieutenant according to his insignia, flanked by 2 armed sailors. The officer was perhaps 25 years old, clean-shaven and serious-faced, and he spoke in heavily accented but understandable Japanese. "I am Lieutenant Robert Morrison of the United States Navy," the officer said. "We have received reports that your vessel is towing an object of potential military significance. I am authorized to inspect this object and, if necessary, to take possession of it on behalf of the U.S. military authorities." Takeshi bowed politely, a gesture of respect that was also a strategic choice to appear non-threatening. "I am Takeshi Yamamoto, captain of the fishing vessel Kayo Maru. We discovered the object approximately 5 hours northeast of here, floating in the shipping lanes. We did not know what it was, but we believed it might pose a hazard to navigation, so we secured it and brought it here to report to the proper authorities." The lieutenant nodded, seemingly satisfied with this explanation. That was the correct action. "May I see the object now?" Takeshi led the American officer and his escort to the stern of the Kayo Maru, where the mysterious cylinder still floated in the water, secured by the 2 tow lines. Lieutenant Morrison leaned over the rail, studying the object intently, and even from where Takeshi stood, he could see the young officer's expression change from professional interest to something approaching alarm. Morrison exchanged rapid words in English with his men, too quick and idiomatic for Takeshi to follow, and then he turned back to the Japanese fisherman with a new urgency in his manner. "Captain Yamamoto, I need you and your crew to step off the boat immediately. This situation requires immediate attention from specialists, and I cannot allow you to remain in proximity to the object until it has been properly secured." "What is it?" Takeshi asked, though he already suspected that he would not receive a complete answer. "What have we found?" The lieutenant hesitated, clearly weighing how much information to share. "I am not at liberty to discuss the specific nature of this object," he said finally. "What I can tell you is that it is indeed U.S. military property, that it was never intended to be in these waters, and that its recovery is of the highest importance to my government. You and your crew have performed a valuable service by retrieving it and bringing it here. You will be compensated appropriately, and I will ensure that your cooperation is noted in my official report." Within the hour, the Shimoda waterfront had been transformed into a scene of intense military activity. More American personnel arrived, including several officers of higher rank than Lieutenant Morrison, and specialized equipment was brought to the dock. A floating crane was positioned near the Kayo Maru, and divers entered the water to attach proper lifting harnesses to the mysterious cylinder. Takeshi and his crew, having been firmly but politely removed from their boat and the immediate area, watched from a distance as the object was carefully raised from the water. As it emerged, streaming seawater and gleaming in the late afternoon sun, its full size and configuration became apparent. It was indeed approximately 15 feet long and perhaps 5 feet in diameter at its widest point, painted in a dark finish that made it difficult to see in water. The fins were more elaborate than they had appeared from a distance, suggesting sophisticated hydrodynamic design. But what caught Takeshi's attention, and what caused an audible stir among the gathered Americans, was a series of markings that became visible as the water sluiced off the object's surface. They were American markings, stenciled in paint that was only slightly faded, including what appeared to be serial numbers and technical specifications. The Americans worked with practiced efficiency, securing the object to a heavy-duty flatbed truck that had been backed onto the dock. Thick straps were passed beneath and around the cylinder, and wooden chocks were positioned to prevent any movement during transport. Throughout this process, the area was kept clear of civilians, and several American military police established a perimeter to ensure that no unauthorized persons approached. The level of security and the obvious concern on the faces of the senior officers made it clear that this was no ordinary piece of military salvage. As evening approached, and the object was finally loaded and prepared for transport, a U.S. Navy captain, a man in his late 40s with graying hair and a weathered face that suggested extensive service at sea, approached Takeshi. The officer introduced himself as Captain James Patterson and requested that Takeshi accompany him to a nearby building that the Americans had requisitioned for their administrative offices. In the small room, furnished with basic military furniture, Captain Patterson invited Takeshi to sit and then sat down across from him. A translator, a Japanese-American sailor, stood to one side, though Patterson began speaking in surprisingly good Japanese, suggesting that the translator was there more as a formality than a necessity. "Captain Yamamoto," Patterson began, using the naval courtesy title, though Takeshi had no formal military rank. "I want to thank you personally for your actions today. The object you recovered is of significant importance, and its loss would have created serious complications for my government." "Can you tell me what it is?" Takeshi asked, genuinely curious despite the obvious security concerns. "I have been at sea my entire life, and I have never seen anything like it." The captain hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "What I am about to tell you must not be repeated to anyone. Do you understand? This is a matter of the highest security, and loose talk could have serious consequences." Takeshi nodded his agreement, and Captain Patterson continued. The object is a nuclear weapon, one of 3 that were prepared for potential use against Japan before the war ended. 2 were successfully deployed against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The 3rd, the one you recovered, was being transported to Tinian Island for possible deployment when the aircraft carrying it experienced mechanical problems shortly after takeoff from Guam. The crew attempted an emergency landing on Tinian, but they were forced to jettison the weapon into the ocean to reduce weight and maintain control of the aircraft. The drop was made from low altitude in a designated area that was supposed to be clearly marked, but apparently currents or other factors moved the weapon from the expected location. Takeshi felt his blood run cold as the implications of Patterson's words sank in. A nuclear weapon. He knew little about such things beyond the terrible reports that had begun to filter out from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Stories of entire cities obliterated, of burns and radiation sickness, of destruction on a scale that defied human comprehension. And his crew had spent hours towing such a device through the water, had nearly lost it to the ocean depths, had come within moments of disaster when it had begun to sink unexpectedly. Was it armed? Takeshi asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Could it have detonated while we were handling it? No, Patterson said firmly. The weapon was not armed when it was jettisoned, and without the proper electrical detonation sequence, there is virtually no possibility of an accidental nuclear explosion. However, the conventional explosives that form part of the detonation mechanism could potentially have been triggered by severe impact or fire, which would have released radioactive material without creating a nuclear yield. So while you were not in danger of a nuclear explosion, there were other risks associated with the weapon. The captain leaned forward, his expression earnest. That is why I am grateful for the professional manner in which you handled the situation. Your caution in approaching the object, your care in securing and towing it, and your decision to bring it directly to port, where proper authorities could take charge, all of these actions demonstrated good judgment and likely prevented a serious incident. They spoke for another 30 minutes, with Captain Patterson asking detailed questions about exactly where and how the object had been discovered, the condition it was in when found, and whether Takeshi had noticed any other unusual debris or objects in the same area. Takeshi answered as accurately as he could, describing the location relative to known landmarks and navigational points, and confirming that they had seen nothing else unusual in the vicinity. Finally, Patterson stood and extended his hand in the American fashion. Takeshi rose and shook it, the gesture feeling strange but appropriate, given the extraordinary circumstances. You will be compensated for your time, for the use of your boat, and for the service you have provided, the captain said. I am authorizing a payment of $5,000, which I believe is more than fair, given the significance of the recovery and the risks you undertook. $5,000 was a fortune, more money than Takeshi would normally earn in several years of fishing. It would provide security for his family, allow him to repair and upgrade the Kayomaru, and give his nephew Hiroshi resources to build a future beyond fishing if he chose. But even as he accepted the captain's offer with appropriate gratitude, Takeshi felt a profound sense of unease about the entire situation. As he left the American administrative building and walked back toward where Kenji and Hiroshi waited near the dock, the full weight of the day's events began to settle on him. They had recovered a nuclear weapon, one of the devices that had brought such terrible destruction to Japanese cities, and they had done so purely by chance, stumbling upon it in waters they had fished for generations. The randomness of it, the sheer improbability, seemed to suggest some larger pattern, though Takeshi was not a philosophical man and did not pursue such thoughts far. Hiroshi rushed forward as Takeshi approached, his young face eager for news. What did they tell you, Uncle? What was it? Takeshi glanced around, noting that several people were within earshot, and shook his head slightly. "Later," he said quietly. "For now, know that the Americans are satisfied with our actions and that we will be well compensated for our efforts. The object has been identified as U.S. military property, and it is being transported to a secure facility for proper disposal or storage." "But what kind of weapon was it?" Hiroshi pressed. "Surely they told you something." "Some things are better left unspoken," old Kenji interjected, his tone making it clear that the conversation was closed. "The war is over. We have done our duty as citizens and as men of the sea. That should be enough." The three of them returned to the Kaiomaru, which had been released by the Americans and was once again under their control. The boat showed no signs of damage from the day's unusual activities, though the tow lines and grappling hooks would need to be replaced, the strain having weakened them beyond acceptable safety margins. They secured the vessel for the night, checking all the standard items, ensuring that everything was properly stowed and that the boat was ready for the next day's fishing. That evening, Takeshi invited both Kenji and Hiroshi to his home for dinner, a simple meal prepared by his wife from their meager stores. As they ate, he told them what Captain Patterson had revealed, watching their expressions shift from curiosity to shock to a kind of stunned disbelief. They sat in silence for a long time after he finished speaking, each man grappling with the knowledge of how close they had come to disaster, how easily the day could have ended in catastrophe rather than compensation. "We were lucky," Kenji said finally. "In war and in peace we have been lucky. Not all men can say the same." In the days that followed, the incident was largely forgotten by the wider world. The American military maintained tight security around the recovery, and no public announcements were made about the nature of what had been found. Local fishermen knew that something significant had occurred, but without details, the stories and speculation gradually faded. Takeshi, Kenji, and Hiroshi kept their knowledge to themselves, honoring the agreement Takeshi had made with Captain Patterson and recognizing that some truths were too dangerous or too disturbing to be widely shared. The compensation money, when it arrived through official U.S. military channels 2 weeks later, was divided according to shares in the fishing venture. Takeshi took the largest portion as owner and captain of the Kaiomaru, but ensured that both Kenji and Hiroshi received generous amounts. For Kenji, the money meant security in his final years, the ability to live with dignity despite having lost his sons. For Hiroshi, it meant opportunity, the chance to pursue education or training that might lead to a future beyond the uncertain prospects of post-war fishing. Takeshi himself used his share to repair and modernize the Kaiomaru, installing a more reliable engine and purchasing new nets and equipment. But he also set aside a significant sum for his children's education, recognizing that the world was changing and that the skills that had sustained his family for generations might not be sufficient for the future. The sea would always be there, but the nature of how men made their living from it was evolving, and he wanted his children to have choices he had never had. In the months and years that followed, Takeshi occasionally thought about that August morning when they had discovered the cylinder floating in the waters off Tinian. He thought about the terrible power contained in that unassuming metal shell, about the destruction it could have wrought had it been successfully deployed, and about the randomness of war and fate that had placed it in his path. He thought about the men who had died in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, victims of weapons similar to the one he had pulled from the sea, and he felt a complex mixture of emotions that he could not fully articulate. Sometimes, late at night, when sleep eluded him, Takeshi would stand on the deck of the Kaiomaru, anchored in Shimoda Harbor, and look out at the dark waters of the Pacific. Somewhere out there, in waters he had fished and navigated his entire life, a weapon of unimaginable power had lain hidden, waiting to be found. The fact that he and his crew had been the ones to discover it, to secure it, and bring it safely to shore seemed like something more than mere chance, but whether it was providence, duty, or simply the unpredictable nature of the sea, he could not say. One evening, perhaps 6 months after the incident, Hiroshi came to visit his uncle. The young man had decided to use his share of the money to attend technical school, to study engineering and mechanics rather than follow his family tradition of fishing. Takeshi supported this decision completely, recognizing that the war had changed everything and that the old certainties no longer applied. As they sat together on the deck of the Kayo Maru, watching the sunset over Shimoda Harbor, Hiroshi asked the question that had been troubling him since that day in August. "Uncle," he said quietly, "do you think we did the right thing in bringing that weapon to shore, in putting it back into the hands of the Americans? What if it is used again? What if our actions contribute to more destruction?" Takeshi considered the question carefully before responding. "We are fishermen," he said finally. "We know the sea. We know fish and tides and currents. We do not know war, we do not know weapons, and we do not know the decisions that leaders make about such things. What we found that day was beyond our understanding, beyond our control. All we could do was act according to our nature, to bring something dangerous to shore where it could be properly handled. Whether that was right or wrong in some larger sense I cannot say, but I believe we acted honorably, and that must be enough." Hiroshi nodded slowly, seeming to find some measure of peace in his uncle's words. They sat together in companionable silence as darkness fell over the harbor, 2 generations of the same family, bound together by blood and by the shared experience of that extraordinary August morning when the sea had yielded up one of its most terrible secrets. The lights of Shimoda came on one by one, American military facilities and Japanese homes alike, a constellation of human presence against the vast darkness of the Pacific night. The Kayo Maru continued to fish the waters off the Izu Peninsula for many years after that day. Takeshi eventually passed the boat on to a younger cousin when age and failing health made it impossible for him to continue working at sea. He lived to see Japan rebuild and transform itself, to see his children and grandchildren prosper in a world very different from the one he had known. But he never forgot that morning in August, never forgot the weight of the tow lines straining against the cleats, never forgot the moment when Captain Patterson had revealed what they had actually recovered. Old Kenji passed away in his sleep one winter night, 3 years after the incident. He had lived those final years in relative comfort, thanks to his share of the compensation, and his funeral was well attended by the fishing community that had been his entire world. Takeshi spoke at the service, remembering his old friend's skill and knowledge, his quiet dignity in the face of terrible loss, and his courage in facing each new day despite his grief. He did not mention the nuclear weapon, that secret they had shared, but he thought about it as he watched Kenji's casket being lowered into the ground. Hiroshi graduated from technical school and went on to have a successful career as an engineer, eventually working for one of the major Japanese corporations that led the country's post-war economic miracle. He married and had children, and though he left Shimoda and the fishing life behind, he maintained close ties with his uncle and returned regularly to visit. Sometimes he and Takeshi would take the Kayo Maru out for a day on the water, not to fish, but simply to be at sea, to feel the motion of the waves and to remember where they had come from. On one of these occasions, perhaps 15 years after the recovery of the weapon, Hiroshi asked his uncle if he had ever heard anything more about what had happened to it, whether the Americans had ever publicly acknowledged its loss and recovery. Takeshi shook his head. "Some stories are not meant to be told," he said. "Some events occur in the shadows, known only to those directly involved. Perhaps that is for the best. The world has enough to worry about without dwelling on disasters that were averted, on weapons that were found before they could cause harm. As Takeshi aged and his memories of that day became more distant, he sometimes wondered if it had really happened at all, if perhaps the entire incident had been some elaborate dream or confusion. But then he would remember the weight of the tow lines, the concerned expression on Captain Patterson's face, the enormous sum of money that had transformed his family's circumstances. It had been real, all of it, as real as the sea itself. In the final years of his life, Takeshi developed a habit of walking along the Shimoda waterfront in the early mornings, when the fishing boats were preparing to depart and the smell of salt and fish was strongest. He would watch the younger generation of fishermen going about their work, using technologies and techniques that would have seemed like magic in his youth, and he would reflect on how much had changed and how much had remained the same. The sea was eternal, indifferent to human affairs, continuing its ancient rhythms regardless of wars or weapons or the ambitions of nations. He died peacefully at the age of 81, surrounded by his family, his mind clear to the end. Among his possessions, carefully preserved in a wooden box, were several documents related to that August day in 1945. There was the official receipt for the compensation payment, signed by Captain James Patterson. There was a brief letter from the U.S. Navy thanking him for his service and cooperation. And there was a photograph, taken without his knowledge, showing the Kayomaru towing its mysterious cargo into Shimoda Harbor, the cylinder just visible in the water behind the boat. His children found these items when sorting through his effects, and they finally learned the full story of what their father had done. They debated whether to make the information public, to contribute to the historical record by revealing this incident that had been kept secret for so long. But ultimately, they decided to respect their father's silence, to keep the secret as he had kept it. The documents were placed in a family archive, preserved for future generations, but not shared with the wider world. And so, the story of how a simple fishing boat pulled a nuclear weapon from the waters off Japan, averting what could have been a terrible disaster and quietly returning a piece of the war's deadly legacy to those who had created it, remained largely unknown. It existed in the memories of a few aging men, in classified military documents stored in archives in Washington and Tokyo, and in the silent depths of the Pacific where the weapon had briefly rested before being discovered by fishermen who were simply trying to make a living from the sea. The Kayomaru itself continued to operate for many more years after Takeshi's death, passing through several owners and undergoing various modifications and upgrades. Eventually, deemed too old and too small to compete with modern fishing vessels, it was retired from service and sold to a maritime museum in Shimoda that specialized in preserving the town's fishing heritage. It sits there still, carefully maintained and occasionally taken out on the water for demonstration purposes, a tangible link to a past that grows more distant with each passing year. Sometimes visitors to the museum ask about the boat's history, about the catches it made and the storms it weathered. The guides tell them about Takeshi Yamamoto and his long career as a fisherman, about the war years when fishing was dangerous and difficult, and about the boat's role in the local community. But they do not mention that August morning in 1945, when the Kayomaru and its crew stumbled upon one of the war's most closely guarded secrets, and, through skill and caution, and perhaps divine providence, brought it safely to shore. The Pacific Ocean, vast and deep and filled with mysteries both known and unknown, keeps its secrets well. Beneath its surface lie the wrecks of hundreds of ships and aircraft, the debris of war and peace, and perhaps other weapons and hazards that have never been found. The fishermen who work these waters know that they are never truly alone, that they are constantly passing over history and tragedy and the accumulated detritus of human conflict. But they continue their work, as their fathers and grandfathers did before them, trusting in their skills and their boats and their knowledge of the sea to keep them safe. And somewhere in the archives of the United States military, buried among thousands of other classified documents, there is a file that details the loss and recovery of a nuclear weapon in the waters off Japan in August 1945. The file contains technical specifications of the weapon, reports from the aircrew that jettisoned it, and a detailed account of its recovery by Japanese fishermen and subsequent return to American custody. The file is marked with the highest security classifications, and it is unlikely ever to be fully declassified or made public. But it exists. A paper trail of an incident that could have changed history had it ended differently. Captain James Patterson, who handled the recovery operation and who paid out the compensation to Takeshi Yamamoto and his crew, went on to have a distinguished naval career, eventually retiring as a rear admiral. He never spoke publicly about the incident, though he apparently discussed it in private with other officers and included a brief mention in his unpublished memoirs. Those memoirs, written late in life, acknowledged the professional manner in which the Japanese fisherman handled the situation and expressed his belief that the recovery had been providential, occurring at exactly the right time and under exactly the right circumstances to prevent what could have been a catastrophic loss of the weapon to the ocean depths. In the broader sweep of history, the incident is a footnote, an obscure event known to few and remarked upon by even fewer. The nuclear weapons used against Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the larger questions of their use and their consequences have been debated endlessly by historians, ethicists, politicians, and ordinary citizens. But the weapon that was not used, the one that slipped into the ocean and was pulled back out by fishermen who had no idea what they had found, has remained largely forgotten. Perhaps that is appropriate. Some stories, some events, operate best in the shadows, known only to those who live them and to the historians who preserve the complete record. The fishermen of Shimoda continue their ancient work, going out each day to harvest the sea's bounty, mostly unaware that one of their predecessors once performed an extraordinary service that prevented a potential disaster. The sea keeps its secrets, the archives keep their files, and life goes on, as it always does, with the extraordinary quietly hidden within the ordinary, waiting perhaps for some future moment when the full story can finally be told.